everyone. Welcome back to the American Experiment podcast. My name is Grace Keating. I am here with Kathryn Hinderaker, as always.
Hello.
And we are so excited to be joined today by Senator Jordan Rasmusson. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you. It's my first time on your show.
Yeah, welcome to the studio. We squeeze into this little corner in the back. It looks, I feel like, on camera pretty nice, but it's really like a really hot kind of like little corner of a closet. So, welcome.
It's a nice setup. Yeah, great to be with you.
Well, that's been a very dramatic start, I would say, to the 2025
Yeah, you guys,
session.
you're in the Senate, which is not getting as much like fanfare, obviously not as much drama, I think, as the House. So I'm excited to have you talk about, what's been going on in the House, or in the Senate. But I think first, maybe we should talk about you, if you don't mind, a little bit about, tell us your background and what area. Well, let's start with how you got into politics. How did you end up in this role where you're at right now?
Yeah, so I've been interested in politics since a pretty young age, loved watching presidential campaigns and just, seeing the energy around politics and getting to decide what issues are important for our country to address. And what, got me running for the legislature was a longtime state representative who I grew up knowing decided to retire and asked me to run for the Minnesota House. And after a lot of back and forth thinking about whether or not I should do it, just ultimately felt called to go serve and have really enjoyed the opportunity to represent the people in West Central Minnesota and to get to roll up my sleeves at the Capitol and try to get some good work done on their behalf, try to stop some of the bad ideas from taking place.
It's a big job.
It's a big job. There's lots of bad ideas out there.
Yeah.
And I'll be starting my 5th session in the legislature. I've served one term in the House before running for the Minnesota Senate.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. And then you serve kind of like the Fergus Falls area. Is that right? You just put it in your terms. And then are you from there or are you a transplant?
Grew up in Fergus Falls. My wife is from Fergus Falls, graduated from high school there. And so it's definitely home for me. I'm the 6th generation of my family to live in Otter Tail County. And then I represent 5 counties in West Central Minnesota. So it's a lot of Minnesota Lakes country. And then you have the Red River Valley farm country that borders North Dakota and South Dakota. So it's a lot of really great people, fun communities, a lot of parades. We did 26 parades last summer. And so really get to enjoy summers in Lakes country.
That's a gorgeous part of the state. I was just up for a wedding there not long ago.
I was just thinking about that because I was at a cabin, a friend's like little lake house. Is that something that is common? Like, do you have a lot of people who, their family isn't even native to, they live mostly in another state. They don't vote here, but they certainly care about what's going on in Minnesota because they have property here. Is that the case for a lot of people in your district, would you say, or is it kind of a small minority?
I feel like half of North Dakota has a cabin.
Right. Okay.
And so I definitely hear a lot about the contrast, right, between what's going on in North Dakota and their more business-friendly approach, lower taxes, and then the impacts we see on the Minnesota side where we're really driving businesses and entrepreneurs out of our state. And the district I represent also borders North Dakota and South Dakota. And so folks that I represent get to see the impacts of higher taxes, higher regulations, and what that means for Minnesota families.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. We've done a series called Border Battle here a lot of times and talked about those differences. And so many people, I feel like, really, we have such beautiful lakes here in Minnesota. You go up north, gorgeous scenery, and people are like, I have to spend 6 months in a day somewhere else, even though I love it in Minnesota. So I always think that's really sad to hear because there's so much to enjoy about Minnesota. But for financial reasons, people are like, it's just not worth it,
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your professional background? Where did you get into politics right out of school? Where'd you go to school?
Yeah. So did my undergrad at Harvard after graduating from Fergus Falls High School. And after college, went into the business world. So I was a management consultant at a firm called McKinsey & Company. And so traveled around the world helping businesses become more productive, help them think about growth and how they can compete in this ever more competitive global environment we're in. And then after that was recruited to become a private equity investor at Bain Capital in Boston. And so there we would analyze and look to purchase companies and then again, try to improve their operations. And so I think that's been a background that's been really helpful in the legislature because there's not a whole lot of numbers people. And actually, it's really interesting. We get the budget documents in a PDF, which for someone who's used to working with spreadsheets is kind of odd. And so they always send me the spreadsheets so that I can look at the numbers. And there was this one time when I was serving in the House where I found $1.5 million error in a budget bill where they had duplicated the same spending program twice. And so, I think watching the numbers, doing due diligence on the state budget is something that I've been able to take my business background and apply to the work we're doing every day.
I am so reassured to hear that there's someone.
Yeah, we got to come back to that because there's a lot of talk nationally about Doge and all these things they're doing to look into government efficiency. Obviously, it seems like we have issues with that in Minnesota. Second of all, you were one of the first people I've met who, went to Harvard and doesn't really just lead with that right away. That was very impressive. We had to drag it out of you. I'm like, wow, this is an incredibly smart, accomplished person, but you clearly led with the people of Fergus Falls. It's beautiful.
There are some conservatives who've made it through Harvard. So, I always say, it helped perfect, my ability to argue against liberals. I had 4 years experience in college, and that's something too that I hope that our higher education institutions can get back to. It's not, about one ideology versus another, but really that intellectual vitality of allowing people to have that debate of ideas. And I think that's good for everyone.
Totally. So moving into what's going on now in the Senate, can you guys do anything? I'd like to get into kind of like the technical aspect of this, where there are a lot of rules kind of talking about if the House isn't adjourned, the Senate can't get a lot done. Is that true? Are you guys also stalemated, or are you able to keep working on things as this is going on?
Yes and no. And so in some ways, the Senate, we organized on the first day. We had a power sharing agreement that had co-presiding officers, co-chairs, and committees. And so that was working for the first 3 weeks. Democrats on Monday, when they got their deciding vote in a special election, they decided to end the power sharing agreement and just take the kind of full majority control of the chamber. So the Senate is meeting. We're having committee hearings, processing bills. However, in order for anything to become law, it has to pass both the House and the Senate. And so even as we're doing our work, I think everyone is looking over to the House and saying, well, what does this mean for the end of session? Even if the Senate passes these bills, how is the House going to take them up in time? And we're really up against the clock in this budget year. And so it'd be really great if Democrats in the House would show up for work.
Yeah, so there's pressure now mounting, not just on House Democrats, but also on Senate Democrats and Governor Walz to kind of get their DFL colleagues back at the Capitol. Are you hearing from your constituents at all, to get the House DFL back at the Capitol, back to work? Are you hearing from people in your area?
This is an issue that has, I think, permeated to Minnesotans that maybe don't even pay that close of attention to what's happening at the Capitol. Yeah. And they understand when someone doesn't show up for work and takes a paycheck, that just doesn't make sense to them. And I think they're not getting into the squabbles of a power sharing agreement or who's speaker or who has committee chairs, but they just expect legislators who are paid by taxpayers to show up and do their job, introduce bills and ideas, debate them. And so I think there's frustration that work is not being done because one party has decided not to show up.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's important. The ripple effect it has over to you guys in the Senate, too, and being able to get anything done. This isn't just contained to the House. It has an effect on everyone in the legislature. So the other thing we wanted to talk about a little bit, the power sharing agreement, it ended recently, right? I thought this week because you got a new member. Is that correct?
It ended yesterday. So when we started off the legislative session because of the death of Senator Carrie Dietzich, who is a well-respected member on both sides of the aisle, it meant that we started with 33 Democrats and 33 Republicans. And so we negotiated a power sharing agreement, and it was working really well. We were able to have bipartisan committee hearings. Both Republicans and Democrats were putting forward ideas. And unfortunately, Democrats, when they won that special election in the heart of Minneapolis, which they were expected to win, within minutes of that 34th senator for them getting sworn in, they ended the power sharing agreement. So that would have happened yesterday. And so I think even though we had these so-called blue dog Democrats who had talked about wanting to work on a bipartisan basis, as soon as they had the opportunity, they empowered the progressive left of the Senate Democrat caucus and basically kicked bipartisanship to the curb. And so we got to see the votes on that, unfortunately, yesterday.
Yeah, it really shows how you have to look past the rhetoric that goes on in this state, with anyone, and just look at the actions.
That's right. You can give speeches, you can talk, put out a press release, but your votes are really determining what the outcome is.
And talk about votes on something like the Nicole Mitchell situation. So I believe, tell me about what the Senate Republicans proposed and what happened, because it's my understanding that she participated in the vote to keep herself in the Senate. Is that correct?
That's right. So last week I brought a motion to expel Senator Mitchell from the Minnesota Senate. And for your listeners who maybe don't remember, she was arrested back in April in the basement of her stepmother's home after attempting to burglarize her, and at 4 a.m, and has really given no reasonable explanation for her behavior that day. And we have repeatedly asked for her to resign the Senate. And then she has unfortunately used her privileges as a Minnesota senator to delay her criminal trial, which is supposed to start last week. And so on Monday last week, we brought a motion to expel, and every single Democrat stood with Nicole Mitchell on a procedural vote to block the vote from going forward.
Even the ones who at one time called for her to resign. Yeah, right?
Governor Walz has called on her to resign. Ken Martin, who's now the national Democratic Party chair, called on her to resign. And a number of Senate Democrats also said publicly that she should not be serving in the Minnesota Senate. But when it, again, came time for them to vote on that issue, they all voted in lockstep to protect Senator Mitchell and keeping her vote in the Senate. And I think that the sad reality is that if the Democrats had a 2-3 vote majority in the Senate, I think they would have booted her. But because she is their majority-making vote, they need to keep her around. And even though they have not put her on any committee assignments, they supposedly don't allow her to attend their caucus meetings, they still need her vote to pass any of these budget bills to end the power sharing agreement. And so it's one of these, that they keep her around out of convenience, even though she's really not representing her constituents.
Were you personally surprised by the total, lock and lockstep actions of the DFL in voting to keep her in?
I was. I actually thought that, because a few Senate Democrats had publicly said that she should not be in the Senate, that they would put up some votes. It takes a 2/3 vote to expel someone. So I anticipate that we would have some Democrats supporting, but not enough to actually expel her.
Sure.
But no,
she might have looked better.
They decided to all stick together and all vote to not even proceed to that vote to expel.
I just love that she voted for herself to stay in. Like, that is so crazy. That's very funny to me.
Just total lack of integrity. I always go back to that. It's disappointing to see an elected official.
We saw that especially in the session, look back at the last 2 to 4 years. I mean, we've had session after session of the DFL trifecta that was just crazy. They were all completely in step with each other. And even the people who claim now to be like blue dog Republicans or whatever, were completely in line with the far left on their side of the party. And now, even as the far left is coming out of fashion, we see, on a national scale, things are happening that show that, look, people are over, a lot of these insane radical policies that people like the Minnesota DFL have been pushing for the last couple of years. No, they will not. They have not yet, kind of fallen in line with that and realized that this is what people want. I think that'll come back to bite them, but
I agree. I mean, I think voters are smart, right? And they're going to get to see the track record under DFL trifectas for the last 2 years. And they're going to see, did Democrats, who did they put first? Did they put state government first, or did they put Minnesota families first? And I think when I talk to my constituents, they understand that the Democratic Party, when they had control, they put their special interest friends first. They put the left-wing activist base first of the Democratic Party, and they really left Minnesota families behind.
Now, there's one more technical issue that I wanted to get your thoughts on. It sounds like there's maybe a rule in the legislature that, like one body, House or Senate, can't adjourn for more than 3 days without the permission of the other body. Is that a concern for the Senate? I mean, are people worried that, okay, well, the House has been apparently adjourned for quite a while without permission of the Senate? Are people going to look back on this legislative session, even after things are resolved, things are passing, and say, well, none of that was legitimate because you broke this 3-day rule? Is that a concern?
It's a good question. And I'll say from the outset, I'm not an attorney. I just play one on TV. But it's in our Constitution that one body can't adjourn without the permission of the other for more than 3 days. And what I would say is, the House is basically trying to start session, right? And then you have the Secretary of State gaveling them out. And so I think, they have been trying to meet. They just haven't had a quorum to conduct business. So the issue would become if the Senate decided they wanted to adjourn for a longer period of time, we have to ask the House permission. And there isn't really a House there to grant permission. So we'll just have to see how this issue continues to play out. And it looks like the courts are going to get a chance to weigh in again.
And who knows what the courts will say?
House.
Like, really, I think, this is so obvious. Well, I guess I'm not a lawyer either, but it never has come out exactly how I think it will. So I guess we'll see. Should we get into some of the issues you're working on? I want to talk about one big one because there was a story that broke, last night by the Star Tribune, actually. Fraud. There's more fraud. I mean, okay, this is this came from like an agency I'd never even heard of. There's so many, I can't keep track of them all. But anyway, the number's up to what,
610 million? Yeah.
That tracker is impressive. I just always have to check on your guys' website and see where it's at. Yeah.
It's depressing, but yes, it is. So talk about fraud. What is your plan in the Senate to address this insane amount of fraud that's going on in our state?
So I think you just have to go back to now former U.S. Attorney Andy Lugar, who is a Joe Biden appointee, who said Minnesota has a fraud problem.
Yeah.
Right. And this is, in a national context, Minnesota kind of stands alone in terms of the frequency and scale that we've seen in public services fraud. And so we clearly have a problem. But if you've asked Democrats for the last few years, they've said nothing to see here. Republicans always talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, but it's a fraction of 1%.
Yeah.
And now it seems like almost every day, if not every week, we're seeing a new human services fraud story, whether it's with substance use disorder, child care providers, PCA services. That just continues to be more and more fraud. And I'll just give one example. In the area that I represent, there's a community of about 2,500 people, and there was a fraudster who was involved with Feeding Our Future who claimed to be feeding 2,000 kids a day in a community of 2,500 people. Right. And so you don't need some sophisticated AI tool or Inspector Gadget to go figure that out.
Yeah.
You could just do a Google search and say, I wonder if 2,000 kids are being fed a day in this town of 2,500 people. And the individual didn't have a lease, didn't have a physical location, was just billing the government for millions of dollars. And so the real issue is that government agencies aren't doing their job. And so a couple of proposals that Republicans in the legislature have put forward are to strengthen the office of the legislative auditor. And so we have oftentimes the legislative auditor will come out and find issues of waste, fraud, and abuse, make recommendations to agencies, and the agencies don't follow the recommendations. They just kind of put it in the shelf and say, thanks for the feedback, but don't actually implement it.
And is that separate from the state auditor, or is that the same thing? I'm thinking of, who is it right now, like Blaha?
Yeah, our legislative auditor, her name is Judy Randall, does a great job. She has bipartisan
we should have
respect
all these
and support.
auditors, but I don't know what they're auditing.
And it doesn't matter if the agencies don't listen to their recommendations. And so one of the bills that I have with Representative Jim Nash in the House is to strengthen that process, ensure that we're keeping track of the recommendations and if agencies are implementing them. And then we also are supporting a statewide Office of Inspector General. We have to centralize this anti-fraud function in state government and make sure that we have someone to hold accountable, because the state agencies that have had their own Office of Inspector General, they have been failing. And currently right now, the Department of Human Services, the one that's had the most fraud, that office has been vacant. And so this is something we need to put the focus on. Minnesotans are generous people. They want to help their neighbor, but they want to make sure their tax dollars are going to where they're supposed to go, not to fraudsters.
Yeah, it's so kind of sinister because it's all things that, people want their tax money to go towards, even, helping feed kids or helping people with specific disabilities or things like that. And so for the fraud to take place in such kind of these emotional ways, it's really sad. It makes you feel just really sad that people can take advantage of the system that way. And when Feeding Our Future was going on and, Bill Glahn was exposing a lot of these false sites and things like that, like you say, he was driving around looking at things like, do you think they fed 3,000 kids out of this apartment in, way up here? Where did they all park? How did they get here? There were just these basic questions that were like, that doesn't really make sense. So it didn't take a whole lot of work, but yeah, if they're not listening to the recommendations of the auditor, duh.
Yeah. Do you feel, I think it's so maybe encouraging to see that mainstream media is finally acknowledging that there is a fraud problem, and, the DFL generally is acknowledging that. It sure took a while for them to get to that point. Or do you feel like this is a very popular issue with Minnesota voters? Or is it just kind of like a conservative Republican issue?
No, I think this is something I hear about all the time, where Minnesotans, regardless of their political background, are frustrated with this issue.
Sure.
And I think where you really saw that turning point is when you had Andy Luger, again, a Joe Biden appointee, say Minnesota is this outlier when it comes to COVID fraud. We have a clear issue. A lot of the people that were involved in the childcare fraud were involved in Feeding Our Future and these other frauds. So it's not just isolated events. It's really organized crime that's looking to defraud Minnesota taxpayers.
And you see it on a national level where now, things like Doge are really picking up steam. I saw the, White House press secretary yesterday. She was listing off these crazy things that were in the budget for the federal government. Is that work you guys have done? Not only fraud, but waste of money? Like, giving condoms to Gaza was the one that went kind of viral over the weekend. Are there things like that you're looking into?
Yeah. So if you take a step back, when the Democrats had complete control of state government, they increased state government spending by 38% in one budget cycle, right? And that's how you spend the...
Wait, that's insane.
38%, right? And that's how you spend the nearly $18 billion surplus and raise taxes $10 billion. So they just had a complete spending spree.
Oh, gosh.
And so, yes, there's a lot of wasteful spending in there. I think one area that really offends a lot of Minnesotans is how much the Democrats spent on freebies for illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
And so you look at whether it's free college tuition, free health care, a lot of benefits that Minnesotans don't have, people that are here in the state legally paying taxes. And so that, when we were looking at how we can cut government spending, that has to be a key area where we can't be encouraging illegal immigrants to come to Minnesota because they can get freebies here that they can't get in other states.
Right, exactly. So what about other goals? Do you want to talk about anything else? You guys released this Minnesotans First agenda in the Senate. What are some of your other goals as far as policy goes this session?
Big thing is around affordability. We are hearing from constituents all the time about the Democrat tax increases over the last 2 years, and also the inflation that Democrats did with their runaway spending nationally and here at the state level. And so it's really about putting Minnesota's families' budgets first and not state government spending. And so one of our big priorities is no new taxes. Even though the Democrats have created,
Thank you.
the Democrats have created this budget deficit that we're heading into. Minnesotans are taxed enough, and we need to make sure that we're reducing government spending, focusing on key needs, whether that's education or nursing home services, public safety. So we're okay spending money for good things, but we have to cut back on that wasteful spending that's really unnecessary.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I saw recently, that there was kind of bipartisan support for sports betting, something that might actually happen this session. What do you think about that? Are you a pro, con? What do you think?
And in the Senate Republican caucus, we have some people that are in favor of mobile sports gambling, others that are opposed. I'm opposed to it. And the big concern I have is, especially with the mobile gambling piece, you're really putting a casino on people's phones.
Wait, can you say, okay, so basically you can bet on the games from your phone.
From your phone, yes.
Okay.
And long term, if you talk to these sports betting companies, their long-term goal is to put slot machines, roulette, blackjack on people's phones too. And so if we're concerned about social media addiction, if we're concerned about the impacts that phones are having, I just don't know if it's smart for Minnesota to put a casino on people's phones. So I'm totally in favor of allowing sports betting on premise. That's what Wisconsin, North Dakota, and South Dakota have done.
So where you have to go to the site.
You have to go to a casino,
like
place
we're
a
in
bet.
Canterbury, but like with sports.
Yes.
Right?
So you could go to a physical location, place a bet, but I have concerns around putting a casino on people's phones. But
Sure.
that's a debate that we'll have this legislative session. There's some Senate Republicans, like my friend and colleague Jeremy Miller, who would love to legalize mobile sports gambling this year, and then we have others that have concerns.
What's the pro to legalizing it? Is it just like freedom generally? You should be allowed to do it. What else do they say as what's the argument for it?
I think proponents will talk about, well, we can tax it and bring in revenue and give it to certain things. I would if you look at some different iterations that have come out this last year, most of the taxes that come in are actually going to be used to basically subsidize other forms of gambling. So to go subsidize the racetracks because they won't be getting a license as a part of some of these deals. Also to bring down the tax rate for charitable gambling. And then also to help fund problem gambling, because I think everyone recognizes that problem gambling is going to increase when we expand access to gambling on people's phones. So, some people in other states, they put it towards education, they put it towards roads and bridges. So that's some of the other arguments you'll hear from proponents is, we got to get that tax revenue.
It's just like the barrier to entry for that kind of mobile sports gambling is so low. Now, when you watch, any of these football games or whatever, you see DraftKings Sportsbook or whatever, just text this number and you're like, choo. And, it's super easy. So I do think that's something to discuss is how now, if I want to gamble my money, I have to go somewhere and I have to go to a casino or whatever. The barrier to entry for that sports betting is just so low. And so many people watch sports and see those ads.
And we've seen this really been a fascinating national experiment because before a Supreme Court case in 2018, states couldn't legalize sports gambling. But since that case, we've seen a number of states legalize, other states haven't. And we have data on the impact it has on families in those states. And one of the most stark data points that I've seen is research that shows that personal family bankruptcies in the state go up 25%. And that's not among people who actually sports gamble. That's just among the general population in these states.
What?
And
oh my gosh.
So it has a big impact. We have the data now. And so I'm glad that Minnesota, whether you're in favor or against, I'm glad that we have been, slow in this race, because now we can see the experiences and hopefully learn from what other states have experienced.
Wow, that's crazy.
It really reminds me of like the whole marijuana legalization debate.
Yeah.
Is it freedom versus maybe like health and safety? And I'm really excited to watch this issue progress through the session this year.
I agree.
Yeah, me too. So the last thing maybe we can talk about is education, if you don't mind. There was some data that came out, was it this week or last week? It must have been the end of
late last week, yeah.
That 29% of students in Minnesota cannot read at grade level.
8th graders, I think it was.
Okay, yeah. 8th graders cannot read at grade level. So,
and that's just the stat that got worse. Like all the other stats are equally bad.
The same. This one got worse, but the rest are just still as bad as,
like 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
Post-COVID levels. So what are your plans to tackle education, the lack of reading literacy, things like that in Minnesota?
Well, this was one of the benefits of the power sharing agreement we had for the last 3 weeks, where Senator Julia Coleman, who's one of our leaders on education policy, she had a series of hearings where we listened to educators. We literally had a day where we brought in teachers and they talked about the challenges they're facing in the classroom. She brought in administrators and talked about the challenges of all of the Democrat mandates that have really eaten into their budgets over the last 2 years. And so for us, it's how can we empower parents? How can we empower educators to tackle these issues and not try to run every single school from St. Paul?
Sure.
And so I think that's something that's really important. And then when it comes to literacy and literacy programming, this is something in our Senate Republican education budget last biennium, we proposed way more funding for literacy than the Senate Democrats did. And because we know the priority it has, if kids don't know how to read, it's really challenging to learn the other subjects. And so you need to learn to read, and then you read to learn. And that's something that we're going to put a priority on. But unfortunately, Democrats, they spent a bunch of money on other mandates, on unemployment insurance, to basically pay people not to work in school districts. And, for us, we're going to continue to focus on keeping resources in the classroom and empowering educators and parents to do what's best for their kids.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to hear it. This feels like such a common sense bipartisan issue. I think every, Minnesotan parent should be upset to hear that 29% of 8th graders can't read at basic level. So I hope you guys really tackle it this session.
And I think that a lot of people too, like our age, are talking way more about other options, especially people who we went through this COVID era and saw all kinds of these crazy things happening, right, in schools. And many people said, I need a new option for my kid, whether it's online or in a private school or in some sort of pod or, whatever it be, homeschool. People, I think, of our generation are going to want so many more options, and they're going to demand that right now. I feel like Minnesota, we have some options, but certainly we could do much better in terms of school choice with an ESA bill or something like that. I don't know if you think that has any traction, if Democrats are completely opposed, but I think that's something that is coming in the future, no matter what, just because of what we've seen going through COVID.
Yeah.
I think empowering parents is really key. And I think parents want to be more involved with their kids' education. If you look at which students are successful, it's oftentimes students who have parents who are involved in their education.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to make sure that, a lot of times the Democrats, I think, want to fire the parents, right? They want the school district to do more and more and more, and they don't want parents to be involved. And for Senate Republicans, it's about involving parents, empowering parents to do the right thing for their kids. I also think we have to look at emerging technology. And for example, what's the opportunities that AI presents to create individualized plans for students?
Sure.
To basically test them where they're at and then come up with a plan that maybe a teacher couldn't do for the 30 kids in the classroom, but using technology, they're able to actually meet the student where they're at, understand what the barriers are to their success, and to get them moving forward.
That's some Harvard grade thinking right there. What I would say about that. Thank you so much, Senator Rasmuson. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Great to be with you, and I look forward to coming back.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. We are going to take a few minutes, read some of our favorite comments from last week's episode. Last week, our question of the week was, what do you think House Democrats are doing while they're sitting at home and not showing up to the Capitol? And I think my favorite comment on this came from Paul. He said he thinks that the DFL members from the House are sitting around at coffee shops, reading the emails that their constituents send to them, but they're reading them out loud and making fun of them with funny voices. I think that's hilarious and is probably true.
Probably.
Kathryn, did you have any generally loved comments?
Yes. This one is like kind of a mind bender, if you will.
Okay.
I think we should have the Electoral College for governor in Minnesota, so the governor has to actually care about us people out here with just the rocks and cows.
Oh, I see. Ooh, interesting. We've had a lot of Electoral College.
I know. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know how much. Yeah, that's super interesting. I don't know how much would that change. I do think we're in this sort of interesting situation as a state where the cities are so blue that it just drags, the whole state in that direction in a lot of ways. But then at the same time, like, look, we have great, conservative representation at the national level in some ways. Some of those representatives, from rural areas, they're awesome. And they have a lot of power. So yes and no.
Yeah. I love that the Rocks and Cows branding is like still going strong. Like that comment was made years ago and people still proudly refer to themselves.
It's so indicative of how Governor Walz is, claims to be from Mankato, a rural guy. And then he's like, well, this is all just rocks and cows.
Yeah.
So it's just, I think it really nails it,
Totally
it gets to the heart of it. So I love that people keep bringing that up.
Yeah.
Then also we got some supportive comments. Kelly says, we are with you, Kathryn. This is nuts and a stupid way of getting nothing done. Very frustrating. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it. Shout out. So I love seeing your comments. Hope you enjoyed the interview this week. Senator Rasmussen was awesome. And keep up with the blog. We've got breaking news every day on what's going on in the legislature. Capitol Watch comes out on Sundays and is a great way to stay up to date as well. And otherwise, anything else?
Like, comment, subscribe, turn on notifications, all those things to help us grow and make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
See you next week.
See you next week.